Hello, I'm David Lockington, Music Director of your Pasadena Symphony and Pops, and I want to welcome you to Pasadena Presents, our spring collection. In our first program of the new year, you'll be hearing Mendelssohn's Octet and Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, and I'm thrilled that Chi-Yan was able to be here to record on stage at our beloved Ambassador Auditorium with Sini Huang accompanying her on the piano. Our own Pasadena Symphony musicians, of course, will be performing the octet for you. They are Elizabeth Hedman, Sarah Parkins, Irina Voloshina, Arusiak Baltayan, Aaron Altman, Carrie Holtzman-Little, Dane Little, and Trina Carey. The genius polymath Goethe, who wrote one of the early Romantic period foundational stories, The Damnation of Faust, about selling your soul to the devil, knew both Mozart and Mendelssohn as youths. He had this to say about Mendelssohn, and he's talking to Zelter, Felix's teacher. Musical prodigies are probably no longer so rare, but what this little man can do in extemporizing and playing at sight borders on the miraculous. And I could not have believed it possible at so early an age. And yet, you heard Mozart in his 7th year at Frankfurt, said Zelter, Felix's teacher. Yes, answered Goethe, but what your pupil already accomplishes bears the same relation to the Mozart of that time that the cultivated talk of a grown-up person bears to the prattle of a child. So in Goethe's opinion, Mozart's youthful compositional maturity paled in comparison to Mendelssohn's, and the octet, written at the age of 16, amply demonstrates that fact. Mendelssohn's father, on the other hand, thought it was Felix's older sister, Fanny, who was possibly more talented and certainly dedicated. Mozart's and Mendelssohn's upbringings couldn't have been more different. Abraham sheltered Felix, while Leopold exploited Wolfgang. Born about 20 years after Mozart's early death, Mendelssohn grew up in a very affluent family. This is where he wrote the octet, in a garden house behind the mansion on Leipzigstrasse in Berlin. And here's the front of the family home they moved into the year before the octet was written. Clearly, the family banking business had been good to the Mendelssohns. The mansion also hosted salon-style events where ideas were shared, and incidentally, Felix's grandfather Moses was a famous philosopher, and also where musicians performed, including, of course, the 4 Mendelssohn children, and their efforts were many. Mendelssohn wrote almost as studies for the octet, 13 string orchestra symphonies between the ages of 12 and 14. And of course, Fanny was prolific too, as well as being a wonderful pianist. Sadly, she was subject to the inevitable sexism of the time and was destined to become the hobbyist composer wife of a successful artist. So, while the sick and tortured Beethoven was entering his last year, the affluent Rossini was chatting up King George IV in England and would retire 5 years later after writing William Tell of overture fame. And poor, impoverished Schubert was writing his last symphony, actually enjoying a little financial warmth and unknowingly preparing to be a pallbearer at Beethoven's funeral, only to die a year later. Well, while all this was happening, young Mendelssohn was writing the masterpiece you're about to hear. Mendelssohn's musical roots were deep. He had an aunt who had studied with Bach's eldest son, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, and another teacher was a pupil of the legendary Clementi, who engaged in a competition of keyboard virtuosity with Mozart. Another important mentor was Michel, whom Mendelssohn studied piano with from 1824, that's the year before he wrote the octet, and who became a lifelong friend. Michel had studied with Beethoven's teachers, including the infamous Salieri, and assisted Beethoven on his opera Fidelio. He wrote this about Mendelssohn: "This is a family the like of which I have never known. Felix, a boy of 15, is a phenomenon. What are all prodigies compared with him? He's already a mature artist. His elder sister Fanny is also extraordinarily gifted." Shortly afterward, he wrote, "This afternoon, I gave Felix Mendelssohn his first lesson, without losing sight for a moment of the fact that I was sitting next to a master, not a pupil." Mendelssohn wrote his first symphony the year before the Octet, and his famous incidental music to Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream the year after, for a family production. The scale of the Octet is enormous. The beginning has a detailed, billowy verve, which is bristling with volatile potential. The moments of repose have a simple, folk-like maturity to them. And later, an original, spacious, ethereal kind of emptiness. The lilting slow movement spends quite a lot of time in unexpectedly shadowy lands. In the scherzo, which was inspired by Goethe's Walpurgis Nacht from his Damnation of Faust, flits along helter-skelter. Its playfulness is contrasted again by sudden moments of unique suspended animation. The pointillistic falling fourths anchor the scurrying sixteenths. And they actually anticipate the Handel quote that's coming in the last movement, "And he shall reign forever and ever." Mendelssohn actually creates an extended fugal section symbolically depicting this never-ending reign. A clever and forward-looking device Mendelssohn includes is a reappearance in the finale of material from the scherzo. Here it is in the scherzo. And here it is in the finale. Now, this continues the trend towards greater structural unity and cyclical forms that dominate the 19th century. The winds of change were blowing fast. Berlioz was soon to premiere his brilliantly descriptive Symphonie Fantastique, while Mendelssohn, a year later, in 1830, would present an eye and ear-opening performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, music which had almost been forgotten. And so the two musical threads for the 19th century were set in motion. The visionary innovators, Berlioz, Liszt, and Wagner, side by side with the passionate traditionalists, Mendelssohn, Schumann, and Brahms. For all Mendelssohn's originality as a young person, his music captured the spirit of traditional values of his times. This Biedermeier period followed the tumultuous Napoleonic Wars and produced artists who were basically non-political and were more oriented towards family life. While not a family man, Tchaikovsky will fit actually into the latter category, adopting traditional German templates for his Russian themes while eschewing progressive Russian experimentation. About 50 years after the Octet, and 10 years after Mendelssohn's early death at age 38, Tchaikovsky was teaching at the Moscow Conservatory. Having been a driven and very successful mature student there, and getting to know his future wife, Antonina Milyukova, who was a student of his. This was an ill-conceived union, seemingly intended to shield Tchaikovsky from scrutiny about his homosexuality. Antonina's fate was actually much worse than Tchaikovsky. She ended up in an asylum after his death. But it seems that he may have attempted suicide just months into their marriage and subsequently left to recover in Clarence, Switzerland, where he composed his astonishing violin concerto. It seems the 1870s was the time to write a romantic violin concerto. But let's back up a little bit. After the unsuccessful premiere of Beethoven's Violin Concerto in 1806 and Joachim's subsequent triumphant revival at the age of 12, with Mendelssohn conducting in 1843, the next big thing to come along was Bruch's dramatic concerto in 1865. Then another 10-year break before Lalo's picturesque Symphonie Espagnole. This is the one that got Tchaikovsky's juices flowing in 1878. Brahms also wrote his glorious concerto in the same year, and Saint-Saëns wrote his lyrical masterpiece, the Third Concerto, in 1880. But back to Tchaikovsky's self-imposed exile in Switzerland. He wasn't alone. He was joined by a young violinist, composition student, and lover named Josef Kotek, who had been studying with Joachim in Berlin. They played through the colorful Lalo, and Tchaikovsky wrote to his patroness Nadezhda von Meck, writing about the Lalo, he said, "It has a lot of freshness, lightness, of piquant rhythms, of beautiful and excellently harmonized melodies. He does not strive after profundity, but he carefully avoids routine, seeks out new forms, and thinks more about musical beauty. Soon after, Tchaikovsky got down to fashioning his own concerto, which would share some of these qualities. Kotek helped with the violin part, and Tchaikovsky was intending to dedicate it to him. In the end, however, it was social fear that prevented him, and a new merry-go-round of attempted dedications was jumped on and proved almost as controversial as revealing his relationship with Kotek. The great Leopold Auer was Tchaikovsky's next choice of dedicatee. The score was published with a dedication to Auer, actually without his knowledge. People said that Auer said it was unplayable. In any case, it delayed the premiere set for 1879. Years later, Auer tried to correct this misperception. He said, "It is incorrect to state that I had declared the concerto in its original form was unplayable. What I did say was that some of the passages were not suited to the character of the instrument, and that, however perfectly rendered, they would not sound as well as the composer had imagined. From this purely aesthetic point of view only, I found some of it impracticable, and for this reason, I re-edited the solo part." Well, this re-editing caused Tchaikovsky to take offense, as he also did later when his controversial writing in his piano concerto was criticized, but he and Auer apparently reconciled before Tchaikovsky's death in 1893 at the age of 53. I'm assuming most of the issues resulted from the complexity of the first movement. Joseph Kotek must have been able to play it, however. Tchaikovsky loved his playing, and writing to his brother, he reports, "It goes without saying that I would have been able to do nothing without him. He plays it marvelously." The concerto was finally premiered, however, by Adolf Brodsky, 3 years after the month it took Tchaikovsky to write it in 1878, with the famous Richter conducting it in Vienna. The influential critic Hanslick called it long and pretentious, and said that it brought us face to face with the revolting thought that music can exist which stinks to the ear, labeling the last movement odorously Russian. Hanslick also wrote that the violin was not played, but beaten, black and blue. And so another masterpiece gets misdiagnosed for posterity. Incidentally, both Brodsky and Richter had a big impact on British music scene. Brodsky ended up in Manchester, and Richter championing Incidentally, both Brodsky and Richter had a big impact on the British music scene. Brodsky ending up in Manchester, and Richter championing Elgar's First Symphony, which had over 100 performances in Europe within a year of its premiere in 1908. The structural balance of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto is in some ways similar to Beethoven's. The first movement is discursive and monolithic. The second movement is brief and simple by comparison. And the last movement is a dance. Now, Beethoven skips along, but Tchaikovsky stomps and spins furiously. Interestingly, the original slow movement didn't make it, Tchaikovsky opting for a more substantial and melancholy utterance in his canzonetta. One of the charming anomalies of the concerto is that the famous opening melody is never heard again. Now, it's probably this kind of passage work that bothered Leopold Auer, who did end up championing the concerto. The intimacy of Tchaikovsky's main theme is reiterated triumphantly by the full orchestra. Here's the opening theme. And here is the full orchestra statement. The beginning of the last movement is electrifying, following the wind down at the end of the second. Tchaikovsky is incredibly fluid, moving between moods. He can re-establish the rondo theme effortlessly. I hope you enjoy this delightful pairing of Mendelssohn and Tchaikovsky from the stage of the Ambassador Auditorium.